Hi. Our intention with this video is to provide you with some insight into the CAES assessment process. For us, performance is a big part of every service that we provide, whether management development, leadership development, performance enhancement programs, recruitment services, executive coaching, career coaching. Again, performance is a very big component and is the objective of any service that we have. Within that, our ability to assess and evaluate performance capability in individuals, managers, and teams is a key ingredient of our process as well. So we want people to understand the approach that we take to assessment, or at least to have a better understanding of it. And so what we've done is created a few videos that you can get some idea of the things that we look at and how we look at them. And in this case, what we're doing is providing a video where we're comparing three candidates for a position and how the assessment and evaluative process can help in overall decision making. We have another video that goes a little bit farther where we're looking at a team, and we're also evaluating more in-depth from a standpoint of managerial capability and leadership capability. So when you have a moment, you might want to view that one as well. I also would like to mention that in this presentation, it is an example. We're not going into a lot of depth into the various components, the background between the components of what we're assessing, because it would just take too long, nor is there a lot of evaluative coordination. And what I mean by that is looking at how these various characteristics interrelate with each other. Again, it would just be too long. But at least at this point, what we can do is give you a basic understanding of the things that we look at when we're evaluating performance. And hopefully from that, if you have questions, you can certainly ask us more. So I thought I'd begin by giving you a brief background into how we at CAES look at performance. For us, superior performance or above average performance will be sustained over time when a person has the combined technical skills, meaning the necessary educational background, the specific technical knowledge, and any relevant industry experience, and as well the non-technical skills, otherwise known as soft skills or work personality, that would in combination be required to achieve performance success in their specific position with their specific team, their specific manager, and within their specific organizational culture. I'm overusing the word specific, and the reason is that we can create some broad templates of performance, but it's really when we analyze performance in relation to the specific role, organization, manager, and team that we can really ensure that there's going to be a proper performance fit in that specific situation. So along this way of thinking, the only way to ensure that the selected candidates, whether an internal promotion or an external hire, will achieve the desired performance that we want to see is to know exactly what we want to see and then to not settle for anything less. This too often is the problem. Sometimes people don't fully define the performance that they want to see, and other times, even if they try to do that, they will settle for whoever's easiest or cheapest to hire rather than sticking to those defined performance requirements. So we need to identify specific performance outcomes for the role and to define them in relation to specific time frames. Then we can identify the specific technical and non-technical skills that are required to achieve these performance outcomes. We'll need to evaluate the current performance capability and the potential performance capability of our candidates, and this of course requires the assessment and evaluation of both technical capability and non-technical capability. So by doing this, we'll be able to identify the performance gaps that will exist between our candidates' actual capability to perform and our desired performance in the specific position. In the CAES assessment process, we always begin based on the performance objectives of each specific client. So we'll meet with the client, we will start with what the overall expected performance results are that they want to see, and then we'll work back to help them to identify both the technical skills and the non-technical skills that are going to be required for performance success. in interviewing the candidates, we'll first look at technical capability, but then through our online assessments, we'll move to the non-technical side, and then we will interview to both understand and verify the results of the online assessments, but also to conduct those assessments that aren't able to be accomplished through online or written forms. We'll collect this raw data and we'll coordinate it and evaluate it, and then we'll be able to create visual, verbal, or written feedback reports for each client based on their original performance objectives. In this presentation today, we're not looking at technical capability. Our focus is on the non-technical side. I want our viewers to see what's important to us when we're evaluating non-technical performance criteria and to get an idea of the overall process that we go through. But technical is always as important as non-technical. I also wanted to give you an example of the typical charting that we do. From this example, you can see on the right-hand side the scale going from 100 to minus 100, rated as significant, above average, and average. In the middle, you'll see a line. The 0 line represents the general population, and just below that, you'll see the individual characteristics that we're evaluating in EXT, INX, CNC, SUP are all characteristics that we're evaluating. At the bottom, you'll see candidate identifier, so this is candidate A, and they are represented by the orange line on the chart. We're also including an average line, so the blue line represents an average score. And so in this case, we are evaluating 3 candidates, and the blue line will tell us the average score between the 3. That blue line can be used in different ways. We could actually create in advance a benchmark on the position on what we would like to see, and then compare our candidates to that benchmark. In some cases, we could evaluate the team and say, okay, how would our new candidate fit into our team and their dynamics and how they're made up. And a lot of times what we'll do is compare it to their specific manager. And because people come and go on the basis of management, it's very important to evaluate our candidates and how they will potentially fit with the managerial style of the specific manager in the project. We can also expand that into looking at other groups. But again, today all we're doing is looking at 3 fairly similar candidates that we want to see an average score on, and not to go into too much detail as to the specific position or the specific manager. We're just looking at performance in general. So in our first slide, we can see that now we've added in candidate B, candidate C, so we have A, B, and C. We can see our average scores, which is the blue line with the red numbers to the left of each criteria, and we can see the criteria that we're looking at the key on the left-hand side. A few things. It's important to understand that these criteria can't be thought of only on their own. What we do is we take this initial data and then we accumulate and we see the interrelatedness of it. So there is more detail in the background, but for time purposes we can't go into it too much here. I will try to identify areas that might be relevant and so that you can see examples of the need to coordinate information from time to time. As well, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about each criteria because again it would just take too much time. The other thing is, don't get too hung up on the numbers. There's not a big difference between a 53 score and a 50 score. What we're really looking at is overall trends, differences, significant differences between the candidates. And again, we always have to remember that the results have to be considered in relation to the requirements of the specific position. So we'll start off and look at information processing, and we can see out of the 3 candidates that we have, candidate A is much better at processing information, at handling a number of different tasks, multitasking, than the other 2. And what we're interested in here is not just taking on a number of tasks, but to be actually able to perform them well. And certainly, if that's important to the position, candidate A would be more suitable in that than the other two. When we look at the next characteristic, that's behavior control. And what we're looking at here is the candidate's ability to maintain their composure in the work environment when under stress. So we can see that all are pretty good at that. What we're also seeing is that sometimes this score can indicate willingness for a person to assume risk. In this case, none of them are big risk takers, but candidate A would be a little bit more willing to take on risks, very limited risks, very calculated risks than the other two. I should mention that a score below the line is not necessarily a bad thing. Some of our scores are inversely marked, which we'll see as we go along as well. The next characteristic is control and the need for control over people or events. And as you can see, our candidates are pretty low, all of them on this scale. If we are looking at a higher level managerial leadership position, we'd certainly like to see higher levels of control. In this case, our people do have some managerial aspirations, and in their managerial activities, they would tend to be the type that would be hands-off, laissez-faire, group consensus kind of managers. The other thing is that I can mention here is, like any characteristics, we don't want to see extreme numbers. And so if we saw control scores very, very high, that could be a problem. It's like anything else, too much of a thing cannot necessarily be a good thing. And if we look at our next scale, which is self-confidence, all of our people are self-confidence, that's fine. But if we saw the combined result of high, very significant control and very significant self-confidence, what we could say is that person would be reluctant to take advice, would be reluctant to listen, so we'd be very focused on their listening capabilities and their communication skills as well. In this case, that's certainly not an issue. Our next criteria is physical competitiveness, which sometimes can be significant, sometimes it's not that important. We also look at intellectual competitiveness later on in the assessment. But in this case, we're seeing that candidate A is much more competitive than the other two. And in fact, candidate C is less competitive, not only than compared to the other candidates in this evaluation, but to the general population. And that, depending on the position, could be significant or may not be. The next score is decision-making speed, and what we're seeing here is that candidate A is faster in their decision-making, and it's not, again, just decision-making. You don't want to make the wrong decisions faster, but candidate A has a pretty good ability to make the right decisions in an appropriate period of time. Not too fast, but faster than the other candidates. Our next score relates to self-criticism, and this is not, because it's below the line, is not a bad thing. All of our candidates are not overly self-critical. If we were seeing a very high score here, or a higher score on the other side of the line, it would create some degree of concern because self-critical people can be reluctant to move forward. They can be reluctant to change and to grow. In this case, all of our candidates are fine in their self-criticism. The only thing that I would mention is although candidate B is a little bit more self-critical than the rest, if we see extreme levels, that could be an indicator of low self-awareness and an attitude that I can do no wrong and I don't make mistakes. None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. So we would want to be aware of that if we saw a significantly low score there. The next criteria is focus over time, and this is really our candidates' ability to maintain their focus when they're doing a task or an activity. All of them are good. In this case, candidate B stands out from the other two in their ability to maintain focus over time. Our last criteria is performance under pressure, and we can see that all of our candidates are pretty good at performing under pressure. Candidate C, a little bit lower than the other two, but not terribly lower. Again, it depends on the requirements of the position. If there's a lot of pressure involved with the position, we might be a little bit concerned about candidate C. Anyways, that's our first chart. So in our next chart, you can see on the right hand side, our scale has changed from 0 to 100, and of course we have a new key on the left. What we are doing with this chart is showing some overall tendencies based on criteria that's important to us. In some of the items we go into more detail in the next charts. But this gives us a good overview on some areas that are important to performance. The first one being success orientation, and we can see the averages help in this case to a certain degree to give us a quick visual, but we can see B and C candidates being a little bit more focused on success than candidate A. Now that being said, all are interested in being successful, so we shouldn't read too much into that. The other thing is that if we were to break this down, we could identify on a low scorer areas that they're sabotaging their success, that they're allowing negative attitudes, negative things to come in that effectively hurts them from being successful, and we would address that if we were helping them from a performance enhancement perspective. In this case, we're just looking at overall scores, and all of our candidates are interested in having some degree of success. Our next score relates to overall productivity and the productive habits, the productive activities that our candidates incorporate into their daily work. And in this case, we can see again, they're all pretty good. The scores are fine. Candidate B being a little bit more focused on productivity and using productive systems perhaps than the other two. When we looked at the next score, which is really persistence, which is a little bit different than focus over time. Focus is maintaining concentration or perspective on a certain task. In this case, what we're interested in is, will the person be resilient? Will they bounce back from adversity, from setbacks? Will they keep going when the going gets tough, kind of thing? And again, all are pretty good at this. Candidate B stands out a little bit from the others, but we're all pretty persistent in this scale. The next, again, is going beyond what we had said in the previous chart, where we were looking at decision making speed. Now we're starting to focus a little bit more on quality of decision making, and this item we'll break down a little bit. But overall, decision making and the ability to go through various steps in the decision making process, we see that again, our people are all pretty good. Candidate B perhaps stands out a little bit more than the other two in the ability to go through a productive decision making process. The next score is related to team management and team membership, and what we find is people who are typically good team members are also good at managing the team process. So whether it's larger scale leadership or smaller scale taking a lead role in a team environment, what we're seeing from this scale is that all of our people again are pretty capable when it comes to being a team member, a positive team member, and to then be able to manage and interact in a productive team environment. Our next score is overall communication skills. We do a lot of work with communication, and you will see, in this presentation, some detail on communication. But in this case, we're saying overall, do our people have strong communication skills? And absolutely, they're all very similar in that. Next, and a big part of communication is listening, and I think that we downplay that to a certain degree. How then do we look at our people's ability to listen? And again, we're all our three candidates are pretty strong with that. Finally, I've included this one. It's a different one, but I wanted to include it for later reasons. But this is communication feedback, and so this is the ability to give feedback after listening to make sure that the other participant understands the feedback that you're given. And again, all of our people are pretty strong here. So when we look look at these three scores, we can say initially, from an overview on communication, our people are pretty strong. We can say in all of these scales, they're pretty good. We get a quick visual to say, is there somebody who stands out a little bit more than the rest? Yeah, B, to a certain degree, stands out a little bit more than A when you look at the comparative scores. So here we get our first example of how we can go from an overall score down into a more detailed component score. We could even go farther to look at individual answers that were accumulated to get us these component results. But at least now what we can do is start to, on specific details, identify why we got certain scores on certain criteria. You can see again our scale goes from 0 to 100 on the right hand side, but now we've put our averages over to the side so that we can see average scores in these components, and then we can see how our candidates match up in each of the components as well. So now we're looking at what's important to us with productivity, person's organizational skills, their attitude towards productivity, their ability to delegate, their ability to integrate information, and their ability to create and utilize productive systems. And so now we can see on average our people are best at integrating information and perhaps could use some work with their overall organizational skills. And then as we move from left to right, we can see, well, from a productivity standpoint, what are candidates A's strengths and weaknesses, and they tend to match up pretty well with the averages, actually, when you look at it. And then candidate B tends to have different characteristics that are contributing to their productivity scores. In their case, if there was an area to perhaps work on, it would be the ability to delegate, although they're not that different than the rest. But certainly they are showing, candidate B is showing superior scores in an attitude towards productivity and the ability to integrate information. And finally, candidate C, we can see their strength would be, again, in information integration, and perhaps weakest at creating and following productive systems. So again, we need to be careful about reading too much into it. It has to be coordinated with what the productivity requirements of the role would be. But I just wanted to show how we can move from an overall productivity score to a component of productivity score, and we can identify perhaps why one person is higher or lower in their characteristics as compared to the others, and again say what is most important to us with this specific role in this specific environment. And so now again we can, on decision making, move from our initial score in the earliest chart where we were looking at decision making speed, then to an overall decision making score. We can now break that overall score into the various components that we think are important to effective decision making. Again, our scale is on the right hand side from 0 to 100, and now we've identified various components in the decision making process with our averages now brought back in to each component. And so we can see from our averages from all of our people in this scale that checking the decision is probably the worst score that all three candidates have, and otherwise they are all pretty consistent in following a good decision-making process, which would begin with establishing a positive decision-making environment, to generating potential solutions to a problem, to evaluating alternative solutions, alternative courses of action, to actually deciding. You'd be surprised at how often people score very highly in a number of these components, but they can't make a decision for the life of them. And so all of our people tend to be pretty good when it comes to that. Again, checking the decision would be our lowest score for all three. And this can sometimes, again, be interrelated with other components. If people are motivated to move ahead quickly, if they're not paying as much attention to details, if they have high self-confidence, low self-criticism, they can perhaps move forward and assume that their decision is right without taking a moment to verify, to just cross-reference a little bit, perhaps talk to other teammates about the final decision. So in this case, with our people, we might encourage them to perhaps more often go back and just reevaluate that decision. Don't take forever on it, but reevaluate that decision and make sure that you're moving ahead properly. And then finally, of course, we look at it and we say, well, once you've made a decision, are you very good at communicating to the people that would be involved with it, the other people that were perhaps involved in formulating the solution, and most importantly, actually implementing it? There's no sense making a decision if you don't do anything about it. So again, on this scale, we can see that all of our people are pretty good, and we shouldn't be surprised that candidate B, because of their overall results before, would score highest across the board. So from a decision-making standpoint, again, we see B having a better decision-making process, perhaps making fast decisions or decisions faster that are right. And we might have a little bit, but not major, but a little bit concern about candidate A's abilities compared to candidate B's when it comes to overall decision making. So from the standpoint of team membership and team management, again, we can take those overall scores and break them down into various components and compare the strengths and weaknesses of our candidates on the basis of these components. Initially, we see that everybody has a good understanding of team and how to develop a team, how to be a good team member. And I think that this is very important. You can't exclude management and leadership from membership. So typically we see good leaders and good team managers as being good team members. And in this case, all of our people are pretty good at that. Communication within the team is very important, whether a leader giving feedback to the other team members or among the team members themselves. It's very important that everybody be informed, and our people seem to understand that. Leaders develop visions and the direction of the teams and the various things that need to be accomplished, but they also engage the participation of their members. And so again, whether in a membership role or a leadership role, everybody seems to have a fairly good understanding of communicating vision and sharing the vision and participating in the development of the vision. In this case, and again in the previous example of feedback, perhaps candidate A could have a little bit better understanding in that way, but certainly candidates B and C understand the importance of a team involvement in setting the direction and contributing to the vision. Managing conflict, everybody seems to be pretty good at that. That's not a concern. Not only will they manage conflict, but they'll avoid getting into conflict situations. So I would assume that we'd also see some pretty good interpersonal skills as we move farther along into the assessment. But certainly at this stage, we're seeing positive in conflict avoidance. These guys may benefit from a certain degree of better definition and understanding of members' roles and creating structures within the team, as in who's responsible for what. Not terrible, but out of all of our scores, that's probably the one area that we would like to see some increased knowledge and activity in. Also team member development, and so on an individual basis, all of our people have a pretty good understanding of the need to help other people in the team to develop in areas that they may not perhaps be as strong as other members. So we'll see more of a collaborative and a sharing approach because they understand the benefit of if everybody is developing and everybody is constantly growing in their skill set, that the team effectively will grow as well. And then finally, understanding other team members and collaborating. Again, all are very good at this. And so contributes to an overall positive team membership and management score. Again, I wouldn't be overly concerned about anything. A couple of our members could use a little bit of work in certain way, C and A, but again, candidate B seems to be a little bit ahead of the others when it comes to an understanding of team management and team membership. So as we start to move into communication, there's a number of different things that we look at related to communication. And one of the first areas to examine is what we call communication foundation. And in this case, the first things that we're looking at is the level of extroversion that our candidates have and the level of introversion. And as we can see, all three candidates tend to be extroverted. It is not uncommon to see high scores on introversion as well. And in those cases, what we see is a need for the person to have a balance of extroverted and introverted activities and work environments. So in this case, what we do see is the least introverted would be candidate A, would not need as much alone time as perhaps candidates B and C, as we can see by their relatively positive introverted scales. That said, they're not going to need a lot of alone time, but it is important to recognize that people who are overly extroverted need to be out in extroverted situations. If they are isolated, it will cause them stress and their performance will decline. And similarly, introverted people, if they are always in public, always forced to be in extroverted situations, will see similar stress and performance decline. So it's important to realize that from the outset when we're looking at our candidates. What kind of environment do we have? What kind of working conditions do we have? So we want to make sure that we're not entering in with candidates who right off the bat would be put in stressful and therefore challenging performance situations. When we look at our candidates' level of idea of exchange, they're not bad. In a leadership managerial role, we probably want to see higher levels of that, but in all their cases, they're going to be willing to share and to listen to new ideas, which is a good thing. When we look at their communication from the standpoint of intellectual competitiveness, none of them tend to want to get into debates. They'll tend to be quieter. Candidate A might engage in competitive communications, but very rarely. So generally, they're going to take a back seat when a debate is going on or a big issue is being challenged. When we look at confrontational communication, it's not particularly a bad thing, but we do need a little bit of confrontation. From a managerial standpoint, what we tend to see is a reluctance for managers to confront, and this would be, well, your performance is not up to standard, or you're coming in late, or whatever. In our example here, the most likely to confront would be candidate A, but again, that's not going to be at the expense of interpersonal relationships. It's basically saying that if somebody was taking advantage, she would be the first person to stand up and to say, deal with the issue rather than back off. The other two would not be too far behind. In this case, they all handle confrontational communication well. Now, if we go back to what I was saying before about the interrelatedness of things, should we have somebody with poor behavior control on one of our previous scales, what we would see is very possibly high idea exchange, very high competitive communication, and very high confrontational communication. So when this scale is very high combined with poor behavior control, that's where you see the argumentative person who's always getting into disagreements, always getting into fights in the environment. And then finally, all of our people are very strong at supportive communication. This is, I think, very important when it's related to team involvement, managing and leading people. We want to see that. One of the things that's interesting is that often when people don't need supportive communication, they can overlook the fact that some of the people around them can require it, to make sure that they're moving forward in the right way, and they have that support from their manager or their leader. So it's not uncommon to see CEOs who say, well, I don't score high, or they don't score high in supportive communication. It's basically because they don't think about it, because they don't need it themselves. But we do, as leaders and managers, have to be aware of what other people require. It may not necessarily be the same things that we require. In this case, nonetheless, our people are pretty good at supportive communication. So across the board, these scales in the foundation of communication are all our people are pretty good. We also like to look at how our candidates prefer their communication. And here, what we're interested in is how they like to receive communication, whether in visual terms, auditory terms, or kinesthetic terms. And then we're interested in how they process that information that they receive. So do they prefer their information in a step-by-step serial approach, or in a more random parallel approach? And then finally, how do they default in their provision of communication? Do they prefer to communicate in visual, auditory, or in kinesthetic terms? Now you can see, again, this is not a critical measure in comparing candidates, and you can see that their receipt of communication is across the board fairly equal in visual, auditory, and kinesthetic terms, and similarly they prefer to give it in visual or auditory terms as a group, and they tend to process it more often in serial, so step-by-step serial terms. And again, that's not critical to know, but it can be helpful to know from a managerial standpoint how to best communicate with not only the team, which in this case is we want to provide it. It doesn't really matter how we provide it, but we do want to tend towards a step-by-step delivery method. More importantly, how does a manager communicate differently with individuals to best get their message across? And that's what communication is all about. It's not how you prefer to give it, it's how your recipient prefers to receive it. So in this case, we can see the differences between the three candidates. And again, we're seeing typically visual and auditory receipt. You're fine in either of the three, to be honest with you. But what is interesting is that candidate B particularly is going to need step-by-step delivery of the information for them to fully understand, absorb, and move forward with it. Whereas candidate A can basically accept either, and candidate C would tend towards a little bit more step-by-step. So the strongest manager is going to say, when I'm communicating one-on-one with these people, that knowing these various differences between the three, they can shape their communication to best get their message across. These next two scales provide us with some additional insight into our candidates' ability to handle a communication process, and also their ability to listen. So from a processing standpoint, we can see that they're all pretty good at planning how to deliver the message in a way that the person that they're delivering it to will accept. Obviously, candidate B stands out a little bit more in that, and perhaps candidate C could use a little bit of work. The next step in the process is encoding and creating a clear, well-crafted message that will meet the needs of, again, the recipient, and all of our candidates tend to be pretty good at that. how they communicate, choosing the right channel, whether it's verbally or via email or telephone or whatever. Again, they all seem to be very strong at that component. And then additionally, receiving feedback, interpreting the message that they receive from the recipient in response to their original message, all seem to be very good at that as well, with candidate A particularly strong in that component. And then finally, in the communication process, providing feedback from what they have heard from the recipient, again, they are all fairly strong at that. So from a communication process standpoint, all three candidates are very strong communicators. Listening is a very, very important part of communication as well. And in this case, what we've done is we separated out the averages. So we're looking first at preparation to listen, second at active listening, and then third at empathetic listening. And it should not be surprising that based on our previous scale, that we saw supportive communication as being a strength of all three candidates. And so again, to see that as the highest measure when it comes to listening, empathetic listening shouldn't be surprising at all. It's not surprising as well that active listening is the lowest score for all three candidates. That's not uncommon. A lot of times, as people, we tend to, rather than actively listen to what the other person is saying, spend time preparing what we want to say in response, interrupting or whatever. I know I can be guilty of that. So it's not surprising that active listening is lower, but it is pleasing to see that candidate C tends to have strength there. And then if we go back and we say, okay, from a listening standpoint, and if we looked at an aggregate score for each individual, that the best listener would be candidate C, followed by candidate B. Listening is a big thing, whether from a team membership standpoint, from a leadership or a managerial standpoint. The most successful are people who are very good at listening, not only internally, but also listening to your clients, listening to your customers as well. So there's a very important one that we wanted to add into this evaluation. And again, in most work environments, communication processing and listening are essential skills to have. They can even be accelerated in their requirements depending on the type of work that you're in. So if you're in a customer related, sales related, strong listening strengths are an essential skill to have, as well as the most effective communication process skills. Our next charts relate to our candidates' interpersonal skills and how they prefer to interact with other people. And you'll notice that our scale has changed from a minimum of 10 to a maximum of 15, but it still provides the type of information that we want to see. Initially, we've got a measure of our candidates' overall people skills, and as we can see, they're all pretty good with people, so that's not an issue. We also want to know of their level of negativity when it comes to other people, whether it be engaging with the public, engaging with their team, or whatever. Not bad. We're all pretty good. Candidate A is creeping up a little bit. In this case, we want to see lower numbers, obviously, with negativity, but overall, not bad. The next one is assertiveness, how assertive they are with other people. This is interesting. They're all up a little bit, higher than what I would assume, because as you recall, they were not particularly high when it came to confrontational communication, and that's assertiveness is similar to that. So that may be an area in the interviewing process just to explore in a little bit more detail. Again, it relates to the position and the team and all the rest. Is there a need to be assertive? And assertiveness shouldn't be looked at in a negative way. I'm just a little surprised with the results that we've seen so far that there is perhaps a little bit higher levels on this scale than what I would have expected. The next is their awareness of body language in other people as part of the communication process. And again, all seem to be pretty strong at that. And finally, all three are pretty good with social networks awareness. So this is an understanding of the networks that are around them in the workplace and various teams and groups that interact together, how to integrate with these networks, how to deal with them. All of our candidates seem to be pretty strong at that. The next scale is based on a measure of people being givers, matchers, or takers. Givers being people that fully give of themselves and their services to other people. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, takers seem to be always taking and never giving to others. Where up the middle, matchers will tend to provide a balance between giving and taking. In other words, think of it from the standpoint of a business arrangement. I will give you this, but you pay me to do that. Where some people, the takers, always want something for free, and the givers would tend to be freely offering things because of the goodness of their heart. In a business environment, we're going to see varying degrees of this, and in people, there are varying degrees of this. We need to have some degree of balance, but we'll have a dominant trait, and what we see from our averages is that for the most part, our people are matchers, which is good in the business environment. We would probably be concerned if we saw a high degree of taking. That's where people would take advantage of their teammates, the other staff members that they're working with. So we don't want to see high levels of that particularly. What we need to be aware of is C tends to be a high-level giver, therefore would be susceptible if surrounded or when dealing with takers. So we'd want to be careful. I mean, B is not particularly a taker. That's not particularly high. But if we had team members that were high in that score, we would want to be careful of the interaction between givers and takers, because at the end of the day, it will upset interpersonal relationships if one person is taking advantage of the other. In a hiring process, I don't know how much we would work into that. Again, it would take some evaluation of the environment, what kind of environment it is, some evaluation of the team, what are the tendencies of the people in the team, and then hopefully with any candidates looking at them and saying, okay, it may be that candidate C would struggle in an environment that has a lot of people who function as takers or who are naturally takers. So we at least need to be aware of that and to try to create the right relationship right off the bat. So in line with our evaluation of communication and interpersonal skills, we're interested in how people influence other people in the workplace. And in this situation, what we're interested in is push versus pull influencing. And you can see from our individual charts under the umbrella of push influencing, people will use such techniques as force, rules and standards, exchange, so you do this and I will give you this, persuasion, and assertion. And then under the pull umbrella, we will see such techniques as personal magnetism, creating a vision, building consensus, creating an environment of consensus, and joint problem solving. As you can see, in our candidate's case, there's a balance between both, and that's the same with most people. The tendency is towards supporting pull, influencing. It's kind of like you attract more flies with honey type of an approach, and certainly from a leadership and managerial perspective, we're seeing a growing tendency towards pull influencing techniques. That doesn't mean that push is totally wrong. Again, it depends on the situation, it depends on the environment, and it depends on what push technique you utilize. As long as it's getting results and it's not contrary to what you're trying to do, then it can be acceptable as well. But it's not uncommon to see this type of a relationship where there's more of a pull influencing style. And of course, of the three, both candidates B and C tend to employ more of the pull style, where candidate A is more of a balance. And we look at A and we say, well, what are their specific characteristics? And we see that visioning and consensus building are their strongest traits, which are actually pull traits. If they're going to use anything from a push perspective, their first choice would probably be some form of exchange. So even though their scores are relatively the same, we can see that they're using their preferences towards two of the primary pull techniques. When we look at B, similarly, if they're going to use a push technique, it's going to be exchange. But across the board, they seem to have a pretty good balance of pull techniques. And then when we look at C, again, exchange is the push technique that would most likely be used. And we see more of a balance of, or not as much of a balance as with B, a tendency towards joint problem solving and personal magnetism, and a little less on consensus. Again, people are different. This gives us a general overview. We also need to compare what is going to work best in relation to the position in the specific environment. But it's nice to see that all of our candidates have appropriate balances of both and would probably adapt to most employment situations. Our next chart relates to cognitive capability, which is a very, very important assessment instrument for CAES. It's something that we specialize in. I wouldn't say we're completely unique on it. There are other people that work in this area, but not a lot. And the reason that it's important to us is that it is critically important to evaluating a person's capability to perform and their potential to perform at times in the future. There's a lot to it, and here I don't want to spend an awful lot of time in the explanation of what it's all about. There is a video on our YouTube channel that you can access. Feel free to go to that to get additional information, background information about what we mean by cognitive capability and how it relates to organizational development and hiring and promotions and all those wonderful things. What we do mean by cognitive capability is it relates to how a person can handle information complexity and the complexity of a series of actions that they can plan and think through. So how they can solve problems. And when we refer to cognitive scope, what we mean is how far in the future they can actually make these meaningful and detailed plans related to complex problems and projects that could involve many elements, activities, and contingencies along the way. So for us, it's crucial from a candidate evaluation perspective to ensure that there's a match between the requirements of the position and the cognitive capability of any candidates under consideration. So initially what we'll do is we'll go into the organization and understand that component as well as so many of the others to understand how complex the role is and what type of planning time horizon is going to be required for a person to be successful in it. And then, of course, we will go to our candidates to make sure that there's a match. In our assessment process, there's a number of different steps. But one of it is to get a feel for any project work that a person has done, the complexity of the project, and their time frame in which they were contributing. It is helpful, but it won't answer all of our questions related to cognitive, but it's a part of the puzzle, I think. Then we'll ask them about their impression of their planning time horizons, how far in the future that they can plan, and they'll give us their response. But again, both of those are self-reports and not necessarily completely accurate. Where we really need to focus is on the interviewing process, and I think I mentioned before that we can't put all of our assessments online, and this is certainly one of them. the interviewing process requires a certain technique, and it requires us to help a person tell us their ability to handle complexity at this stage in time. And once we can determine that, it helps us to chart and evaluate at what stage in the future they will move to the next level of complexity. So you can see that it's very important, not only from a current position match to make sure that there's cognitive match between the role and the person, but when we're looking at promoting people or hiring people that can come in today at a certain level and then have the potential to move to a higher level down the line, that we need the ability to identify when they are going to be potentially ready to handle larger scope activities and more complex work. So we can see from our candidates that their reporting on the project tells us that they have certain complexity levels, certain cognitive levels. We can see in both projects and they're reported, but what really matters is what we find in the interview, and this is more accurate. So in this case, we can say, well, candidate C was pretty accurate in their self-assessment based on what we found in our interviewing, but candidate B was actually overestimating their capabilities as compared to what we found in the interview. This is important because there has to be a direct match. So if the role that we're looking at requires a person at this capability level, a scope of 1 to 2 years, and the complexity that comes with that, candidate B would be a suitable match in this case. Candidate A would be overwhelmed and would not be able to perform up to the standards of that position. And candidate C would be overmatched and therefore would be bored. And one of two things will happen. They will either fly under the radar and not be overly productive and just get through it, or if they are what typically is the characteristics of a top performer, requiring a challenge and a developmental environment and growing their capabilities, they will leave to go someplace else. So it's critical that an exact match, no less, no more, occur between the position and the candidate. With that in mind, we can also look at the relationship of thinking preferences. And here, we need to remember that if we looked at this from an organizational structure standpoint, that as we move to the top of the organization, the complexity of the work and the time horizons to consider become increasingly larger. So the CEO near the top of an organization has to deal with more complex issues and longer time horizons, obviously, than the person on the workshop floor. So similarly, we can coordinate that with thinking patterns, and what we see is that higher level positions often require more abstract thinking, where lower level management on down positions tend to require more concrete thinking. And if we coordinate then thinking patterns to a certain degree with this, we can see that at the lower levels we would tend to see more concrete sequential thinking then to random concrete thinking, then to sequential abstract thinking, and then to random abstract thinking. And you're now saying, well, what does he mean by all of this? So when we talk about concrete sequential thinking, that's a thinking that's based in reality and a very sequential, realistic, practical, orderly thinking. And people who are good at that are very good at improving processes. So in this case, the dominant trait for person B is this type of concrete sequential thinking. Concrete random thinkers tend to be more experimental. They're more investigative, they're independent, creative, and they tend to be very good at developing practical, innovative products is a good way to put it. So in this case, what we see is the dominant. Our next chart relates to concentration preferences and how we can compare our candidates on the basis of what areas of concentration that they are strongest at and how susceptible they are to distractibility. And you'll see the chart is essentially in two parts. The one is concentration, and the other part is primarily distractibility. When we look at concentration, again, it depends on on what the requirements of the role are typically, and how we can match that, the preference of an individual to what the role would typically require. And everybody has dominant and secondary traits and weaker traits, and it doesn't really matter. One is not more important than the other. It's just how well it matches up to the requirements of the position. So when we look at our three categories of concentration, the first is a person's awareness of the environment, awareness of people in the environment. The second is their ability to strategize, to conceptualize, to analyze information, to plan. And the third would be their ability to pay attention to details, to maintain focus on details for a period of time, and to take action. And again, one isn't better than the other. It depends on the requirements. So if our position requires somebody to have a strategic orientation, then certainly candidates B and C would be most suitable to that. All have fairly good environmental awareness, but that would be the dominant trait. Environmental awareness would be the dominant trait of candidate A, and all have pretty good attention to detail, where again, candidate B would probably be a little bit more comfortable with that than others. Now we can paint broad brushstrokes, and so we can say on a positional basis that managers would tend to have the following pattern: that they tend to be dominant in their ability to strategize and conceptualize. Secondary trait would typically be the awareness of their environment, and their third trait would be paying attention to details. And while some would say, wait a second, I'm a manager and I pay attention to details, well, that may or may not help your performance depending on your situation. If we go back and coordinate some of these components together, and we say, well, if somebody has a high degree of control and they have high levels of self-confidence, and their dominant concentration trait is actually paying attention to details, that's the typical profile of a micromanager. And we would say, well, we can help you with performance by helping you to find ways to delegate those details to other people, so you can pay attention to what, as a manager, you should be paying attention to, is developing strategy and being aware of what's going on around you. Similarly, we can say, well, marketing and salespeople typically have a dominant trait of awareness of people in the environment. Their typical secondary trait would be the ability to pay attention to details and take action. And their third trait would typically be their ability to strategize and plan. And finally, an overall profile for an engineer might be paying attention to details. Third would be strategizing and conceptualizing. And fourth would be awareness of people in the environment. And those of you who know engineers would say, yeah, that typically is how they are. Now, not all engineers are all the same. Not all managers are the same. And not all positions require the same focus of concentration. So again, we adapt it to the specific environment, but at least being aware of the requirements of the environment and the preference of the individual will tell us if there's a potential match. Now, here's a key thing. When we talk about strengths and weaknesses, if you're in an interviewing situation and you ask a candidate their weakness, they will say, well, and this or that or whatever. For me, I don't need to know that. I don't need to ask that, because I know a person's biggest weakness is when they use what they're best at a time when they should be using something else. So, for example, somebody who is under enormous stress will go to what their strength is. So our candidates B and C will strategize when perhaps the situation calls for them to be aware of the environment or to take action or look at the details. Similarly, somebody whose strength is in environmental awareness will revert to that under stress when it may be a time that they should pay attention to details or they should step back and strategize. So again, understanding a person's dominant preference and what they're good at can also tell us what they're weak at when they try to use that in the wrong situation. When we look at distractibility, this has an impact on performance as well. And so we look at our candidates and we say, from a distractibility range in here, we would like to see them outside of that, below that, and certainly not up in this territory, because distractibility will affect negatively impact their performance. And so in this case, we're looking at external distractibility, so things outside of a person, noise or environmental commotion or whatever, and how susceptible would they be to this depending on the environment. And what we can see is that candidate B would be less affected by external distractibility than, say, candidate C, who could be adversely impacted. And so we look at the environment and say how distractive is that environment, and would this candidate be able to function in this type of a role. And then, of course, we go back to our extroversion and introversion, and if candidate C is more introverted and more subject to distractibility from external influences, we really need to get them out of an open concept environment and have them in a closed door where they could close the door, reduce distractions, and have their alone time so that they can maintain their performance. Similarly, when we look at internal distractibility, this is thoughts and feelings, or thoughts primarily that people have internally. And again, we look at candidate B, and very unlikely to be distracted by internal thoughts going on. And in both cases, candidates A and C are less likely to be distracted by that as well. The key here is this, and I mentioned it's called reduced flexibility, and I mentioned this before, and this is the ability of people to shift. And so we talked about it before, the ability to shift between different ways of thinking when it's most appropriate to do. So if in this situation we need to think in a certain way. Our next chart relates to people's motivation, and this is very important, obviously, to performance, but we need to go beyond just saying to people, are you motivated? We need to actually look at some components of motivation and see how they relate, again, to the performance requirements of the position, and how it would people would interact with their team and with their manager, and sometimes the overall organizational culture. So when we look at motivation, one of the key things for us is to look at whether people are proactive in their motivation. Do they move forward, or are they reactive? They wait for things to happen, perhaps take time to analyze information, and are more conservative in that regard. Similarly, we like to look at whether they are motivated towards achieving goals or motivated away from solving problems. And while sometimes people who are problem solvers, they say, oh no, I'm goal oriented, and we're not saying that you aren't, but their goal really becomes solving a problem. So you think of it from the standpoint of quality control people. Away from problems are the kinds of people that you want making sure that the landing gear on the plane actually works. That in effect becomes their goal. But what becomes important is how they interact in these four characteristics. And so some people can be proactive towards goals, and these people will move ahead very quickly, but sometimes make performance errors because they move ahead too fast without fully considering the implications of their actions. Whereas their counterpart, people who are reactive away from problems, these are the people who tend to always come up with another reason not to go forward. We need to analyze more information, and so that they sometimes, to some people, they can take a long time before they actually move forward. Often what we see is what I call the crossover effect, and this is where towards goals people who are reactive, they will move forward toward their goal once they've gathered enough information. So they won't move too quickly and they won't move too slowly, but we need to give them enough time to feel comfortable that they've got enough information that they can move forward and be successful. Similarly, proactive people away from problems, once they understand the problem, then they have enough time to gather their information, they will proactively move forward. So again, we have essentially four different levels of motivation, and it depends on the environment. Do we need people to be fast movers proactively towards goals, or do we need them to take a lot of time to analyze information, or do we need them to be somewhere in between? And from our charts, again, there's no scale on these charts, but we can see that candidate A would be proactive towards goals, so is going to move very quickly, but may make mistakes from omission because they moved ahead too quickly. Whereas candidate B tends to be towards goals but reactive, give me enough time to gather the information, then I'll move towards the goal. And candidate C is the same way. So again, it depends on the environment, it depends on the team. You all have been in an environment where you perhaps are wanting to move forward and you've worked with people who are very, very slow. Well, this is one of the possible reasons why that happens and how that can create frustration within a team. Similarly, a manager has to understand the motivational makeup of their team and understand, okay, this is perhaps why they may not be moving as quickly as I want, or they are moving too fast and I need to pull in the reins and hold them back a bit. When we look at other motivational characteristics, one is, are people influenced by external influences or by their own internal values and opinions? And in this case, what we see is A is very internal, B is very internal, and C is very internal. So in all cases, our candidates like to develop their impressions of a situation first, and then they'll go to the external environment and get feedback to make sure that their impressions are actually accurate, as compared to an external person, which would a good way to identify somebody like that would be a salesperson, where they go to the customer and they get the customer's opinion, and then they make sure that their internal values are congruent with what the customer wants to do. Again, neither is right or wrong. We just need to recognize that when a person's in a role that requires a lot of external influencing and they're an internal person, there may be a conflict in their motivation, and therefore it may cause them stress, and therefore it may cause them to perform at substandard levels. Similarly, if somebody is very external, required to come up with internal decisions, required to create paths and plans and all of that, may be a little bit more difficult for them, and they may be stressed and therefore not be able to perform adequately. Finally, whether people are interested in specific details or general concepts, this can be important depending on the role. Again, we tend to see people in a managerial level be more interested in general concepts. We tend to see people that are in detail-oriented professions like accountants and engineers to be more focused and motivated by specific details. Again, it depends on the role, but if we find somebody that should be detail-oriented and in a role, but they come to us and they're larger scope, general concept people, we have to evaluate on whether there would be a performance fit. And then finally, we look at, again, are people motivated by following set procedures and methodology, or are they more flexible and accepting of random environments, random activities in their work? Again, that can be a big demotivator. We would tend to see the detailed-oriented technical people being very procedural in their approach to their work and requiring that, and perhaps are demotivated and stressed when the environment is actually freewheeling and they can't get control over it. And similarly, our options people who like to have free reign, they like to have variety in the types of work that they do, can be very demotivated when they have to follow set procedures in their work. Our next chart relates to planning styles, and it has an element of motivation to it as well. And in this case, what we're looking at is four basic planning approaches. The first being objectives-oriented planning, where people set specific measurable goals with timelines. They like to plan in that way. Other people like domain and direction planning, where they know where they want to go, but they don't necessarily like to create all the details and timelines within that. The next is task-oriented planning, where they're thinking about the actions along the way and in effect not really planning that far ahead. And finally, where we have existential planning, where people believe that other forces will take care of them and they're not particularly planning at all. What's important is that if somebody has a strong preference for a certain planning style, that they will actually be demotivated by other planning styles. So if their work requires them to plan in a different way than what they prefer, or the environment requires that, they can actually be demotivated. So in this case, we can see that an objectives-oriented planner will be demotivated by domain and directions and task planning. And similarly, a domain and directions planner will be demotivated when they're forced with goals, objectives, deadlines, and tasks. So we just need to be aware of that. I don't think that it's a crucial element, because most people have degrees of both. And when we look at our chart, we can see that of our three, we have relative balance on both objectives-oriented planning and domain and directions planning. Nobody seems to be, interested in existential planning, but we do have a relative balance. What becomes interesting is our candidate B is strongly focused on objectives planning, and will need work and an environment that will support that. Otherwise, they will be demotivated and have performance challenges if they're in a domain and directions or a task planning environment or role. So it's important to be aware of that. We need to, hopefully find people with a relative balance in those styles, because planning is fluid. It's not typically one format. And so again, we go back to our cross-referencing of various characteristics, seeing a balance in planning preferences, and also a flexibility. The ability to move between planning preferences is very important. So if candidate B is not as open to the different planning styles and is inflexible, we could have a real performance problem there. Whereas planning C might not have as much difficulty, or candidate C, or candidate A. So our next charts are all related to change, which of course is a very big part of performance and organizational growth and people development. We've taken a large topic, change, and we've tried to condense it into some key indicators to help you, but there's an awful lot to it. The first thing that we would look at is mindsets, and looking at the difference between growth and fixed mindsets. Growth mindset people tend to be want challenges. They look at their ongoing growth and development. They tend to be change oriented, depending on the degree, least resistant to change as they go along. Whereas people in the fixed mindset category tend to be resistant to change. They tend to want to not see change in their environments and in their work, which can be a big problem for management when they're trying to have the organization or the department proceed and go forward. What's interesting is that in my case, I don't see a lot of fixed change. Most of the people that I see have various levels of growth orientation, but I would also say that high growth is very rare, much more rare than what you would think. So we tend to see people in this range of medium, low, and minimal growth. And of course, in this case, comparing our candidates, we see that candidate C and B are in the medium growth category, and candidate A is low growth. And so from a hiring perspective or developmental perspective, we need to know who's going to be most progressive, most interested in changing and growing in their position, and who's not. Obviously, I don't come across it, but if we had a position that there would be no change in, and we just want people who don't want change, then we would look at people down in this category. But I just don't see that. Most organizations want people who are progressive, who are going to adapt and to change, and so they're looking at people with growth mindsets. When we look at major change, we categorize it in 4 different levels. 1 to 2 year for a major change. These people tend to want ongoing consistent change. 3 years is evolving change. 5 to 7 is evolving change as well, but not as fast. 5 to 7 years. And then, of course, people who prefer major change every 15 to 25 years don't really want a lot of change. They're more focused on stability. We tend to see most people in the 3 year range, even more perhaps into 5 to 7 years. And again, it depends on the organization and the position. But from a retention standpoint, if you have people who are in this category, you're not going to see a lot of internal career progression. They're not going to be that interested in moving up the corporate ladder, whereas people in the 1 to 2 year category, if they have the skill set, are going to be interested in moving up the ladder much more quickly, and of course will leave if they're not able to move as fast as they want to. Again, 3 years tends to be an interesting area for me. And of course, when we look at our candidates, we see candidate C, who has a higher level of growth mindset, tends to be requiring faster major change in their career and in their lives, whereas our candidate A and B tend to be more closer to the average, that they prefer slower evolving change over time. When we look at change management, and this is both from a managerial standpoint, but also from a member standpoint, and how people accept and adapt to change, we can see that our people are relatively similar in their overall understanding and ability to change and acceptance of change. And then when we start to look at the individual change characteristics that are important to us when it comes to change management, we can see that in understanding change, candidate A and C tend to be a little bit higher. Planning change, they're all identical, so they all know how to plan change, and they're fairly high level with that. Managing resistance to change, they're all fairly similar, and that's an area perhaps that we might want to address. We can see candidate C is a little bit better at managing resistance to change, and the all-important implementation of change, we can see we're all pretty good with that as well. So from a change management standpoint, we're all pretty good. We would just perhaps wonder about candidate B and perhaps their understanding of when a change is needed to come about, but across the board, we're all pretty good with that. And again, it all depends on what we want to see in our position. Do we want to see people who need relatively frequent change, or on the other hand, more stability? And when we're hiring people into our organization, depending on the requirements of the position and the team and the organization, what is the best match to what we want and what people are bringing when they walk in the door? And in our final chart, we are looking at overall general management skills. Again, as I said from the outset, we didn't want to focus as much on management or on leadership as we will when we're doing the team development presentation, and certainly look for that in our YouTube channel as well. But because our candidates, we wanted to see if there was some degree of self-management, some degree of capability of managing other people, and so we ran them through this assessment as well. And we can see our averages are again in the blue bar with the red numbers, and we can see how our candidates compare, and from a overall individual managerial strengths, we can identify that candidate C is ahead of the other two candidates to a certain degree. Understanding team dynamics and encouraging team relationships. Obviously, again, candidate C stands out with that. And candidate A is a little weaker on that. When it comes to selecting and developing the right team, right members for a team and to join a group, they all seem to have similar capabilities and fairly high at that. Delegation, which is often a problem with a lot of people, we can see that's down a little bit, and in this case, candidate B would be the weakest of the three. When we look at motivating others, in whatever way that we motivate them through our acting as a role model or in our communications or whatever, we can see that candidate C has enormous strength and potential in that as well, although candidate B is very strong. And so there's some managerial potential there. Again, motivating people is a very important skill set for managers. We get to managing discipline and dealing with conflict. And again, candidate A may be a little bit better than that than the other two. Certainly candidate B would be of concern. And again, then we would cross-reference this with other characteristics, and the first one to come to mind is confrontational communication. And so we would look and say, okay, how strong is this person at dealing with conflict, and how well can they communicate potential conflict resolution solutions to other people. There would be some cross-referencing there. Communication, we know that our people are pretty good communicators, and this is just a different scale from a managerial perspective, and we can see overall they're all pretty strong with that. Planning, problem solving, and decision making, again, we would go back to our other components of decision making and cognitive capabilities and cross-reference that to a certain degree. But again, our people are pretty strong when it comes to that. And then finally, avoiding common managerial mistakes. And this is an assessment where we introduce various managerial mistakes that are common that managers typically make, and we say, okay, do our candidates have a pretty good idea of what to avoid? And again, from that perspective, we see candidate C as being fairly strong. So across the board, then, if we say in hiring somebody, and do they have the potential to be strong managers? Are they showing overall managerial characteristics without yet going into the details of managerial attributes or leadership attributes? We would say in this case that candidate C may stand out a little bit. And if that's the case, is that important in the comparison of candidates and what we want in this particular role and what we might potentially want for the future? I wanted to briefly discuss the CAES assessment delivery and feedback process so that people are clear on how we approach this. We wanted to have our assessments accessible to people at convenient times, and so we moved practically all of them online. People can go online and complete them. The results come back to us, and then we do our evaluation and our report writing from that. In addition, we use the GoToTraining and GoToMeeting computer-to-computer programs where we can use webcams and we can interview. We can do our cognitive interviewing and our verification interviewing with our candidates online when at convenient times from all over the world. And then our assessment feedback systems can be delivered in the same way. We can deliver them verbally if our clients want, or we can provide written reports if they want. But what we tend to see is that people prefer to have a visual PowerPoint presentation, which would be very similar to what you've just seen, that people can look at, and we can get online and discuss the individual results. When we do that, I have to stress it would be a little bit different than the example, because there'd be a lot more cross-referencing of the traits. There would be a lot more compilation of the important details in relation to a specific client objective or a specific position. But from this presentation, you get an idea of what we can do with the PowerPoint. In these online sessions, we can accommodate from 1 to 24 people, and it allows, again, flexibility to communicate with people outside business hours if it's required, and we can accommodate people in multiple locations and different time zones. And of course, again, we can provide visual presentations, document sharing, and a voice and webcam connection between numerous parties. If there's numerous stakeholders in a decision, various people on a team or various managerial people that need to make a decision, they can all be included at the same time. So it's a good system for us. It allows us to communicate as flexibly as possible. Obviously, we like in-person communication as well, and we do that, obviously, also. But for a cost-saving perspective, the online system can help. And typically what we see is a hybrid between some person-to-person and some online, as long as it's cost-effective. Thank you for taking the time to join us and to watch this video. I hope that it's given you some ideas on how to approach non-technical skill evaluation and certainly give you a better perspective of how we do it. Don't forget, it's not limited to candidate evaluation. There's so many different ways it applies. As I mentioned before, there's another video that we have where we're looking at, from a team perspective, managerial and leadership capability. So we go a little bit farther than what we've done in this video. And certainly if you have a moment, take a look at that one as well.